racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but
why do you put it?
Why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas is it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. You know, I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the I understand the conflict of interest problem, but one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Woman there in the green top. Hang on, wait a minute. Let's just get the mic to you. There you go.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not.
Well, because
the best
they've demonstrated
extreme
competence in at least one area of
That's
inquiry.
banking. That's that persona. This is why we're in the situation where we are with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency, there's no accountability that you get in industry, and we don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
But that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude that what is perceived as a good leader.
No, that's not why you have that problem.
Is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know people like to think that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good, it's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability?
So why is
what
that
else do you have?
3% elevated as our leaders? Why is that 3% elevated as our leaders?
They're not. They aren't. That's wrong. And to think that way is counterproductively cynical. It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, or that it's more specifically characteristic of political leaders than people who are operating at the highest level of their capacity in other areas. It's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. Well, it's simply not true.
Let's take another question from Julian. Julian Lee.
With the revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq and footballers still taking the knee, what does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
Nazir.
The brown person will answer first.
Yeah.
No disrespect.
Nazir, so do you think that was wrong of me to come to you first?
I think so. I think.
Well, let's not do it then, Jordan. I don't mean that. I'm not being sarcastic at all. I mean, if that's how you feel, I respect that. Let's go to Jordan. Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to Jordan.
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but
why
would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is, we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was repeatedly
containers
called
of
abusive terms.
undifferentiated
He was
content.
repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's
Okay,
had people
well,
contact him.
then
If
they-
it walks like a duck, Jordan,
Then they
talks
should-
like a
no,
duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that
Yes.
question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem, the concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and
Well,
let's
I
look
did
at the
it once,
evidence
so yes,
that there
I'll
was.
try
So
to
the evidence
control it
was
in the future.
about the... And all of us have a challenge to ask ourselves whether we are normalising forms of racism. And actually, I think that's what Nazir called you to account to about Fiona tonight, was to say we normalise the idea. If we're going to talk about racism, we go to the person of colour first and ask them to give us
can I
their
just
hot
say,
take.
in my defence, I also tried to get everyone on the panel first as well, to make sure so that everyone has a go at the first
don't
question.
think
But
it's
when
fair
we
to
talk
say
about-
that what you did was racist. I don't believe that.
But we're talking
I think
about
what you
Jordan.
did was a mark of respect. And now that may have been inappropriate and it may have been taken wrong, but that doesn't mean it was racist.
But
And
Jordan,
so we
you
are going to be
you asked
precise
us to
about our
define
language.
why the concept of structural racism. And we have a problem in British society. We have a problem particularly in sport. And we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
And how do you talk about structural racism
finish?
without
I'm going
talking
to
about
need to bring other people in as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
Yes, I need to
said
mention
nothing.
Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for
Yeah,
anti-Semitic
and
tweets that he
has
put
said-
out several years
and
ago.
what I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.